Good evening, friends. My name is Jennifer Copeland, and I'm the Executive Director of the North Carolina Council of Churches. I greet you on behalf of the 19 member denominations of the North Carolina Council. These denominations cover the state from toe to heel. They are in rural, urban, and suburban areas. Some of you may be part of those congregations, and if you are, we are glad to have you in the family. Others of you may be part of the justice-seeking wave that the council has been riding since 1935. Tonight, we give thanks for whichever path has brought you here. I'm joined tonight by my colleague, the Reverend Kendal McBroom. Kendal has been on this screen with me before, and so you may already know that he is ordained in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, but currently serving as the Director of Civil and Human Rights at the General Board of Church and Society for the United Methodist Church. At least he stayed in the Methodist family, we say. In this role, he manages that agency's legislative and policy advocacy in support of civil and human rights. Kendal has degrees from Hampton University and Duke University, and while he currently lives in Washington, D.C., we actually claim him as a born and bred North Carolinian. As I've mentioned, we've already had one information session about Christian nationalism, which you can find archived on our website, and you can click on our YouTube link if you missed it the first time around. But in that session, we tried to hit the highlights and the history of this movement, showing you some connections and offering information that might be helpful to you where you are. Tonight, Kendal and I are going a bit deeper. He will trace the big moments in the history of our country and explain how they have often employed Christian nationalist or dominionist theology tactics. I believe if we don't know our own history, we certainly can't shape our future. And once Kendal brings us back up to the present, I will offer an overview of the Seven Mountains Mandate identified by the leaders of this movement. They believe these are the spheres of influence that will bring them the power they seek. The mountains are religion, family, education, government, media, entertainment, and business. We'll take a look at each of those briefly, but we'll take a deep dive into education and business, because I think those might be the ones having the most direct impact on the largest number of people here in North Carolina. And then finally, I'll turn it back over to Kendal, who's going to map out for us some things we can begin to do right now in our communities. As people of hope, we are always going to seek a way forward, a way trusting that God often shows a way when we can't see it, but we know it is our job to keep moving forward even as we step out into the wilderness. Kendal, will you help us understand how we got to this place?
Thank you so much for the laying of the foundation of tonight's conversation and discussion, Reverend Dr. Copeland. And so good to be with you and be with all of you home in North Carolina, because North Carolina will forever be, no matter where I go, forever be home. And so I'm just so thankful for Reverend Dr. Copeland's leadership with the North Carolina Council of Churches, and thankful for the ministries that you all lead day in and day out. And so with that being said, I'm going to kind of give us that foundation and that background as to how we've gotten to where we are today. So the first thing we must understand is that this comes to us, Christian nationalism, also known as white Christian nationalism, comes to us beginning in 1493, and the doctrine of discovery. Some of you may have heard of that. That is when Christopher Columbus returns from Spain from his expedition to the new land and begins the conversion process of many indigenous individuals. One of the quotes that I want to highlight is that to invade, he is given authority in so many words to do the following, quote, to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Sacrians, which are Muslims, and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ wheresoever placed, and the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, that language of dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever held and possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. This quote comes to us from Pope Nicholas V to the Portuguese King Alfonso V, in tying to and in relation to, if you will, Christopher Columbus's expedition. We move forward to the arrival of the Puritans. The early pilgrims arrived from Europe in New England colonies, and they are establishing these colonies under the notion of fleeing from religious persecution and claim the land to be quote unquote a city upon a hill. And we hear in that a deep scriptural reference. Now, one of the things I want to recognize and acknowledge is that while there's the Puritan freedom taking place, fleeing from religious persecution in New England, there is also something else taking place in the southern colonies. Those at that time being really Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia eventually comes in. And what is taking place there is that um, it is not that religious persecution per se or religious fleeing the religious persecution. It is one the mandate from Europe, but there is also an element of they are sending individuals from Europe who either have extensive or very very extensive, very um deep debts. And so they send them to this new land, essentially to pay off those debts as indentured servants, right? And so by doing so, they are there to pay off a debt. And this is not only that, but they're sending children individually. They are sending those that they don't want in their presence, in their midst. They are essentially exporting them, if you will, out of Europe. There is betrayal, exploitation, enslavement, massacre of native peoples, all those things we've heard before. Due to the abuse of religious leaders in Europe at the time and the power of the church, there is an intentionality on the behalf of the founders, particularly Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and others, to not have a state religion. This is one of the reasons for the freedom of religion clause in the Bill of Rights. Although half of the signers, now understand this in the broad context, half of the signers who are signing the Declaration of Independence, half of them have theological and seminary degrees. Many of them are known as deists, okay? Deists being individuals who believe in God, but also believe that God is absent from human affairs, okay? So I want to let you know that's a little bit about the founders as they are curating and creating the Declaration of Independence. We go from there into westward expansion with slavery, boarding schools, and the Civil War. As the U.S. begins to move westward, there are things they encounter, not only native tribes, but they also move all of this. They're doing all of this under the notion and under the framework of manifest destiny, which in layman's terms, manifest destiny is that if I see it, it's mine. Okay. And all of this is ordained by God. If I see it, it's mine. And all of this is ordained by God. Boarding schools by many denominations are created and funded with the assistance from the federal government, the Department of the Interior being a critical part of that, to Christianize. Essentially, these schools are to Christianize the heathen, also known as the eradication of all indigenous culture and practices from the children on reservations. So this is why we have the boarding schools. That is their main purpose and their main goal. Both the North and the South, in during the time of Civil War, use scripture to support their cause for the war. In the North, there's in some ways you could call it some slightly prophetic, because they are saying that judgment will come upon the nation due to the practice of slavery in the South. Whereas the South is saying that there are forces that are seeking to do away with their prescribed and ordained way of life, that being slavery, that being control, that being kind of manufacturing the land in the ways that they see fit, and doing with the land what they see fit, what they deem necessary. Then we move forward from there, from the Civil War into Reconstruction, and we go from Reconstruction to about the 1920s, which is known as the Gilded Age. During this time, you have about those 12 years from about not 1870, when individuals who were formerly enslaved are able to vote. That's the first election that they actually vote in, um, unhindered by and with the support, I should say, not, I won't necessarily say unhindered, but with the support of the federal government, the backing of the federal government. With that, 1870 is the first election that they have. Slightly after that, slowly after that, there is the creation of black codes, the creation of the Ku Klux Klan, a hate-filled Christian nationalist organization. Jim and Jane Crow begin to find themselves that knowledge or that particular legislation in ordinances and societal practices, all upheld by the Bible and Christian theology. So when I say upheld, I'm meaning that they are tapping into the scriptures, they are tapping into the tradition of our faith to support these practices. There also begins to be a rise in fundamentalism with Dwight Moody, who was a gospel singer, Ira Sankey. So we see within this now there is not only the policies and the legislation, but in the church there becomes a concerted effort, both in the liturgy as well as in the music, to support what is taking place as it relates to the creation of the Black codes and the expansion of Jim and Jane Crow. From there, we see also an increasing divide between intellectualism without morality and piety with connection to human and societal concerns. So we see this kind of this divide that is going on within the Christian faith. We see a rise, or we see Protestantism taking place, but from that, there's also evangelicalism that grows, or Pentecostalism, we should say, that grows in the sense that there's a desire for this emotional connection and a desire for this piety and this pious living, but it is completely disconnected from what is taking place in individuals' backyards. It is completely disconnected from what is taking place in front of their yards. It's completely disconnected from what is taking place in legislatures, taking place in their communities, taking place even in their just everyday lives. There's a desire to have these feelings, but for it to be disconnected from the lived practices and the lived reality of the day. During this time, because as you can see, I am currently employed by the General Board of Church and Society with the United Methodist Church. The General Board of Church and Society, born in 1923, created in 1923, is the successor of the Methodist Episcopal Church Board of Temperance, Prohibition, and Public Morals. And so what we do at Church and Society, and what the preceding agency did, was create in so many ways a space to have impact and have influence within national legislation and national conversations, based off of the social creed from the United Methodist Church, then the Methodist Episcopal Church, to have influence on that based off of the social creed. And then we see the creation later down the road, which we'll get to, of these social principles. But that is the impetus for what they are doing. And so then we move from the Gilded Age into the modern era, into the present, to the New Apostolic Reformation, which Reverend Dr. Copeland is going to touch more on, and expound upon. The Civil Rights era sees a strong connection to the faith tradition, to the Christian faith tradition, and moral underpinnings using religious language and practices in the pursuit of the rights for many citizens who had been treated as an underclass. So in saying that, you have in 1955, we know around August, if I'm not mistaken, the murder of Emmett Till. That in so many ways sparks the civil rights movement, because we know it's not until December that Rosa Parks gets on the bus, the Montgomery boycott is kicked off, and all of those things. But it is the death and murder of Emmett Till which is connected to the movement, which launches the movement. But even during this time, there are churches that are practicing a social gospel, if you will. In other words, Abyssinian Baptist Church with Adam Clayton Powell Jr., practicing a social gospel ethic. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, in so many ways, that when he was first at Dexter Avenue, practicing a social consciousness. Even prior to that, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, when all those things are going on um in Germany, is practicing and seeing a social gospel. So I just want to highlight that this is all taking place at that time. Well, from there, there's a backlash to after the civil rights movement. So after the Voting Rights Act passes of 1965, the Great Society package from President Lyndon B. Johnson, there's a backlash from certain undercurrents throughout U.S. society, beginning with the White Citizens Council, the creation of suburbs, and conduct the practice or a practice of white flight, so moving from the cities to the suburbs. As such, churches and congregations begin to move as well. There's a latter rain movement, a shepherding movement, which we can talk more about if there's anyone interested in that. Then there's the teaching and influence of dominionism, weakening the church and state doctrine. So, right, we are familiar with this. There must be a separation between church and state. And it's a clause that is included. But there's a weakening of that, right? Because during this time, there's a creation of Christian schools. These Christian schools are essentially a response and an action of the white flight movement from urban cities, urban communities into the suburbs. So this is where we get the day schools. This is where we get the Christian academies and all that stuff. So that happens. What is taking place, though, is actually antithetical to the teachings of the gospel, Acts, and the Pauline epistles, because we know early on in Acts, about that first and second, and even into the third and fourth chapters, there is conversation, and there is documentation of all of these people coming with different languages, with different cultural experiences, all being in one space. However, they are hearing the voice of God and they are giving God thanks in their native tongue. But and even in that, their common thread is that they are all giving God thanks and praise in God's native tongue. We get to the 80s, there's the rise of the moral majority during Ronald Reagan's tenure. And that is for us who are living in this particular time and age, that is where we hear, see, and are experiencing what is taken, what the moral majority has laid down as foundational for us to understand. And then most recently in this iteration, as of 2023, I believe, we see Project 2025, which brings about all of these groups, which Reverend Dr. Copeland is going to expound upon and lead us into that way. So with that being said, I turn it back over to Reverend Dr. Copeland.
Thank you, Kendal. Going to put my screen up here and talk you through some things. Here we go. I've already mentioned that the 7 mountains are religion, family, education, government, media, arts, and business. Are you seeing my screen? Rachel, talk to me.
Yes, I can see it. Not in the presentation view, though.
Oh, well, see, that's what I want it to be in. Ah, there we go. All right. So these specific spheres of influence were first identified by business tycoon Lance Walnew as he called the high places that have to be reclaimed because they are under demonic influence. That's the kind of language that we regularly hear when we're listening to Christian nationalist leaders. Walnew is also the one who crowned Donald Trump as the new Cyrus in a book he wrote called God's Chaos Candidate, Trump and the American Unraveling. Please don't buy the book. Just know that that's where the notion of Trump as Cyrus came from. By equating Trump to Cyrus, a non-believer who makes it possible for the believers to accomplish their goals, this offers a cover for Christians who might be questioned on why they support a philandering, lying, egotistical, authoritarian ruler. Well, because he's Cyrus. Walnew is not clergy, he's a business person. Though it's difficult to know how he made his money originally, he makes it now by promoting and selling Christian nationalist propaganda. And even though he's not clergy, he's regarded by the movement as a prophet, apostle, and teacher. You may recognize those titles as a direct reference to Ephesians, which lists the gifts for leadership that the leaders of Christianity received from Christ as Christ ascends into heaven. Those titles are regularly used by people who identify with the Christian nationalist movement. So leaders of the movement, like Walnew and his ally Peter Wagner, use language like this. Christians should have dominion over unbelievers through the 7 mountains of influence. They often reference the Great Commission from Matthew 28, used to inspire missionaries around the world, but now it has been rebranded to require Christians to disciple nations and governments, not merely win over individual hearts and minds and souls. Dominionist, authoritarian, and sectarian language is regularly invoked by leaders of the movement, but they also say things like this. The class warfare, violence, and restrictions of free speech that are being embraced by so many today are evil and contrary to Scripture. So far, so good. We believe that the peace and prosperity we all seek will be advanced not by the oppressive Marxist methods used under the misleading label of social justice, but by individuals living and sharing the truths of God's word in a free society. Now, except for the slight to social justice advocates, we might agree with the bulk of Womack's statement. And that, my friends, I think is the real danger here. This heresy purports to be so many things that are familiar to Christians, so many that many of us miss the treachery at work. So I hope by looking at these 7 mandates, we can begin to recognize the danger. Here are some of the trends we're seeing nationally, lest you think North Carolina is the only state languishing in this oppressive heresy. But we have to acknowledge in North Carolina, we are a popular place because we are a state who can make a big difference in November. So we are going to see a lot of action in North Carolina between now and November. At that same rally I referenced a moment ago, Womack concentrated on the government mountain, and he rolled out a plan to take over the city council and the school board of his local community. We cannot ignore the connection between government and business and Christian nationalism. It is an unholy trinity, if ever there was one. I think this connection between big money and the conservative religious agenda dates perhaps as far back as the New Deal. Many of us look on that time in history as a time when Social Security lifted our retired elderly out of poverty, food stamps fed hungry children, the CCC employed able-bodied people, the government funded healthcare, education, housing, all things that contribute to a flourishing society. But everybody was not happy because these things were funded by implementing a fair tax code. Some might say a biblical tax code, straight from the Gospel of Luke. From everyone to whom much has been given, much will be required. And from the one to whom much has been entrusted, even more will be demanded. But the ultra rich in this country, the Gilded Age that Kendal referenced, chafed at a tax code seeking an equitable economy. While any historical diagnosis of how wealth accumulates readily shows that few of us are self-made, we can go back and read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle to learn that. And yet those who have the most seem to think they have worked the hardest. All to say, what we are witnessing is not new, but we are witnessing a new aggressive approach, a comprehensive power grab utilizing wealth, religion, and politics, a dangerous concoction that is very hard to repel. While I do think it's been going on for decades, I think Kendal's exactly right about the election of Ronald Reagan opening the door for more systemic power partnerships between money and conservative Christianity. You remember those people, Falwell, Robertson, Swaggart, and the lesser known but nefarious theological magician Jim Baker in our own backyard. Those people began to dominate the religious conversation. And they tapped into a judgmental, legalistic, and punitive vein of Christianity. Abortion and gay rights became their rallying cry, even while the Southern Baptist Convention was on record in 1973 supporting Roe v. Wade. Believe it, it was true. Other things happened along the way. Government began to favor big business over workers' rights. Witness the minimum wage, which would be roughly $25 an hour now if it had kept up with inflation. Instead, we haven't had an increase in the minimum wage since 2009, 15 years ago. Education funding was chipped away and has finally succumbed to the tsunami of private school vouchers and unregulated schools. Here are some trends we've seen recently in North Carolina. Now, looking backward, we can see how each of these 7 mountains have gradually become our new normal. And then it all came together in 2016 with a president who wouldn't question the unethical methods because he had not only engaged in them, but benefited mightily from them. He spent 4 years ignoring the Constitution, implementing policies favorable to these 7 mandates, and then lying about everything that didn't go his way. On January 6th, the day of Epiphany for Christians, 2021, those who believed him to be Cyrus, remember, they didn't come up with this on January 6th in 2021. This had been brewing for 4 years. Those who believed him to be Cyrus tried to overthrow our government. We cannot overestimate the religious fervor with which people entered the Capitol building, believing themselves to be the new crusaders of a righteous cause. Now think about that, friends. No one considered overrunning the Senate chamber in 2000 when the Supreme Court called Florida for George W. Bush. An election decided by 537 votes in one state, providing the necessary 1 electoral college vote needed by Bush to win the election. And that year, if ever there was a controversy, we had a peaceful transfer of power, just like we had had since 1797. Between 2016 and 2020, in only 4 years, this vortex of business and politics and religion has tightened. And the loss of an election in 2020 has not slowed down this spiraling heresy one bit. That is where we are today. The 7 mandates start tonight with religion. We could probably stay here for the rest of the night. And maybe we'll have to go back, Kendal, and do a whole program just on religion. But if we start here tonight, I just want to point out a few things that are happening that might be a bit odd to us now in 2024. The 10 Commandments are back on display in Louisiana public schools. And you'll remember the 10 Commandment thing has come and gone over the last couple of decades. I think there was a whole thing in Alabama about the 10 Commandments being on display in the courthouse square. But now they're in Louisiana public schools. The Medical Ethics Defense Act allows providers and institutions to refuse services that are against their conscience. Now, you can see how this could be taken to the extreme, and people who desperately need medical care could be denied as a matter of conscience by the provider. And then our personal interest in this is the Charlotte Catholic High School employment case. The council was part of that case through an amicus brief. And the story is that an employee was discriminated on the basis of religious conscience. In this case, Mr. Billiard, who had taught at Charlotte Catholic High for years, posted on his Facebook page his joy at finally being allowed by the law of the land to wed his life partner. He was soon fired for promoting religious teachings in opposition to the Catholic Church. Now, mind you, he had simply posted something on his Facebook page, and he had also taught at this school for years. But that is the case. These mandates overlap because we could list Mr. Billiard's predicament not just under religion, but we could also list it under family. Mr. Billiard's family was impacted by the religion mountain. The family mountain also has several ways to invade our lives. The biggest and probably most headline grabbing of those is reproductive rights. Those restrictions are falling like dominoes across the country since the fall of Roe v. Wade. You could file reproductive rights under religion since a minority religious opinion is dictating healthcare options for the rest of us, and our religious opinions are being ignored. But this is one of the ways that the mandates begin to show up in the public square where we live. There's a ban on gender-affirming care for those under 18 in North Carolina, regardless of what the family or the medical provider's opinion might be. And there are continuous and constant restrictions on LGBTQ family systems. The most obvious is probably adoption. So in many places, gay couples are not allowed to adopt children. The adoption agency can decide whether that's an appropriate family system for a child to be placed in. You probably know of lots of other restrictions on families that are being imposed on people who have no reason to have their rights curtailed. Education is one of the places I want to dig a little deeper. Education is a place that impacts all of us in North Carolina. The REACH Act requires public college students to pass a class in American history to graduate in order to reclaim our history according to a particular understanding of our heritage. You can look up all the things that this particular act requires of folks. And there is also the Parents' Bill of Rights, where parents direct the upbringing of the education, healthcare of their children, and not the schools. Only remember, except when they want gender-affirming care. Charter schools, private school vouchers. I want to spend some time here. There's a lot of text on this screen, so look at the graph and note the steep inclines on the far right. Private school vouchers are conveniently named in North Carolina opportunity scholarships. Just this past May, the North Carolina Senate passed a bill to add $248 million for the 24-25 budget and another $215 million for the 25-26 budget on top of what's already in the budget for vouchers. If these allocations make it through the budget negotiations in the House, we will see a 199% increase in voucher funding since 23-24. In comparison, the K-12 public school budget increase currently stands at just 3%. Just look at the numbers. Now, we need this massive increase in voucher funding because we have removed family income eligibility requirements and prior public school attendance requirements And we now allow in North Carolina any student to receive funds for private school tuition regardless of need. We also have added an additional $13 million designated for administrative costs and up to $1 million designated for marketing, because we wouldn't want anybody to miss the opportunity to use private school money, our public school funds, for private school education. My friends, by the end of the decade, North Carolina taxpayers will be paying upwards of $5 billion a year on private school tuition. Now, make no mistake, this is lockstep with Christian nationalist agendas to take over education. By underfunding public schools, we create a self-fulfilling prophecy that our public schools are struggling, our teachers are ill-equipped, buildings are in disrepair, books are out of date. And the worse the schools become, the more the legislature can argue for charter schools and private school vouchers. The more money that goes to vouchers, the less there is for our public schools, and the worse the schools become. So do you see how this goes? And let's be clear about how much voucher money goes to conservative Christian schools like the one Womack runs in Colorado. Very little of this money, percentage-wise, is going to Durham Academy. So here you can see how much of the money funds religious schools in North Carolina. These are North Carolina numbers. Now, a few common themes on this education mountain include anti-abortion activism, opposition to LGBTQ rights, opposition to sex education classes in public schools. So they're teaching people in the private schools to oppose sex education in the public schools. Just want to be clear about that. Promoting prayer in the public schools. So we're teaching people in the private schools that they should advocate for prayer in the public schools. They want teaching of creationism in the public schools. We've had a little round about that in North Carolina, where creationism had to be taught as an alternative hypothesis to evolution. So those are some of the education mandates that come into this mountain. Now, let's also be clear about who is getting the majority of the voucher money. It is not low-income people of color. And then finally, let's pay attention to the quality of education and the oversight guidelines for these schools. You can see some of the admission criteria at a few of the well-vouchered schools. Schools that are getting millions of dollars have these admission policies. Admitting students on the basis of right fit leaves a lot of room for interpretation. So just imagine if your local public elementary school turned away your child because the school determined it's not the right fit. And as for oversight, the schools do have to follow the 1964 Civil Rights Act prohibiting discrimination on the basis of race, color, national origin. But other forms of discrimination are not expressly prohibited in the North Carolina laws that regulate private schools in this state. As a result, many private schools have policies on the books that discriminate against students on the basis of religion, disability, gender, LGBTQ identity, academics, that one kills me, and lifestyle. So a lot of people protected by the Civil Rights Act are weeded out through these other means. And as for the quality, the North Carolina graduation requirements that are in place for all of our public schools are not necessarily followed by the private schools. There is often no provision for special needs students, and lunch is not always available in a private school. In short, there's no quality oversight. These are self-regulating schools, and since many of them teach creationism and believe the earth is only about 5,000 years old, I have actually heard that one school explained, yes, there were dinosaurs on the ark, at least for a bit. I think that's a great graphic. So let's move on to government. These are things we know well in North Carolina, so we don't need to stay here for very long. Voting rights ebb and wane in this state. But one thing that we know is the Christian nationalists have said often, we don't want everyone to vote. And it's fairly clear that the current General Assembly majority also doesn't want everyone to vote. Voting rights in North Carolina are waning right now. Redistricting has been a perennial problem in North Carolina, but especially since the 2010 census and the 2012 redistricting. So just to give you an example, here's a map of Guilford County. So you can see in 2022, we had basically some fair maps, but now they've been redrawn again. And this is just a kind of a picture, like a Rorschach test of what cracking and packing really looks like in action. Then there's the party makeup. All the Republican legislators and the US Congress representatives against a backdrop of a fairly equal electorate. So here is what we have, and here is who votes. So while we have a fairly equal electorate, we clearly don't have a fairly equal representation. Turning to media, there's a whole cottage industry catering to the Christian nationalist agenda. If you look at this series of news outlets and follow the columns over to the right, you can see that the ones on the left, of course, are considered more liberal, the ones on the right, more Republican, more conservative. And then, of course, we get the biased reporting from these, but there's also a robust presence on social media, print media, all the special networks. Arts and entertainment. Again, another cottage industry of television, movies, music, promoting this particular mandate agenda. The Hallmark Network comes readily to mind, where we have all these wholesome, happy endings in a world that none of us truly can recognize. And then finally, we come to business, another place where I want to pause and go a little bit deeper. I think where we shop matters, and we probably need a more comprehensive list of the big businesses supporting this mandate agenda. But what we need to know tonight is that businesses love deregulation. They love for the government to be limited. I think big business recognized a viable partner among conservative Christians as far back as the Red Scare. You remember that "In God We Trust" was put on our money, and "Under God" was added to the Pledge of Allegiance back in the 1950s. Incidentally, just as Billy Graham was making a name for himself. So who do you think paid for all those early crusades? And why do you think he preached a gospel of free enterprise and the Protestant work ethic? And yet, Billy Graham is tame in comparison to today's moguls. The link was probably not self-evident for most of us, but now it's easy to see who is funding this wave of authoritarian rule. Big business funds Christian nationalists who preach an agenda of low taxes and get people elected who will deregulate big business. So you see how all of this is a vortex that works together. Look for a minute at what happened to the corporate tax rate in North Carolina. This has been a gradual move over the last 10 to 12 years, but it's been exponentially fast since the Republican majority took over our General Assembly. The corporate tax rate has fallen precipitously, and it will soon be zero. It is currently the lowest corporate tax rate among states that even have a corporate tax rate. It is lower than any of our neighboring states. So what happens is business keeps all their profits and the shareholders keep the dividend profits of the business. But we as individuals in North Carolina continue to pay income taxes. But wait, let's look at the individual income tax rate. Those in the lowest income bracket pay the highest percentage of their earnings. Just take a minute and look at how this bar graph goes across the page. The graduated tax system that kept our economy equitable has given way in North Carolina to a flat tax rate. Not only do we have a flat tax rate, but it keeps getting lower, lower and lower and lower. Now, besides the inequity of it, the current trajectory that we are on will lead us to a place where the state does not have the funds to provide the infrastructure and the resources needed by the population. But corporations and wealthy individuals will have all they need and more. I would just like to add, the Bible has a lot more to say about money and how we distribute wealth than it has to say about sex, even if we talk about sex more in church than we do about money. The truth is, God has a preferential option for the poor. It is a thread throughout Scripture. And much of the woe we read in the prophets can be traced to the inequality created by the ruling class of ancient Israel. The story from the prophets is narrated in terms of conquest and exile, and God often gets the blame for allowing these bad things to happen. But God says repeatedly through the mouths of the prophets that the people have disobeyed God's mandates for justice. The truth is, sin is its own punishment. God doesn't need to send in the Babylonians to show us what's wrong. When corporations make billions but still pay their workers a minimum wage that hasn't been raised in 15 years, Babylon is massing on the horizon. Friends, we've got to mobilize our families, our neighbors, our friends, our colleagues to see this danger looming ahead. I believe we can make a difference this fall. I believe we can elect people who understand the common good. And in the meantime, between now and November, we must act locally in the places where we have an ability to make a difference. I'm going to turn it back over to Kendal so he can lay out for us some options for those of us who are ready to get to work.
Reverend Dr. Copeland, thank you so much for breaking that down and really contextualizing that for what is taking place in North Carolina. I think oftentimes for like our position at church and society, we're thinking nationally, but this needs to happen in every state. This type of conversation, and I see some of my friends on the call. As you were talking, I was seeing some of the people who are on, and I see Suzanne Pretty from who we serve on the alumni council at Duke. I saw Reverend Dr. Regina H. Moore of your counterpart in South Carolina, who we've done work together with the voting rights. I see one of my good mentors and colleagues, Reverend Rod Vegas Ingram. And I see my birthday twin and my friend from Alamance County, Dana Courtney, who has been on this battlefield for so many years, and so many others I see. And so I'm just grateful, one, to know that we are here with family and friends, but also to break this down contextually, Reverend Copeland. Like you did an amazing job and amazing research on that. So I'm going to move into what can be done, what we can do in our local context, because oftentimes what I have found is that hearing this information, if it is your first time, or maybe it's not your first time, but just hearing this information will make you feel as though, oh, this is a mammoth. Like what can little old me do, right? But there is stuff that we can do. There is stuff that we can do in our daily lives. There are things that we can do as a congregation. Of course, I see a lot of United Methodists here, which I'm grateful to see. There are things that we can do in our annual conference, or in our cluster, or in our synod. And then there are things that we can do as a community and as a state. So I'm going to share my screen to be able to go there, and let's see if we can play from this. Okay, so this was a presentation that I had created for one of our annual conferences, that we were having this Christian nationalist conversation in Iowa. And so I want to the skills and steps and things that are listed here were beneficial to them, and I believe they'll be beneficial to North Carolina with the necessary tweaking for your local area. But as it says on my left hand, maybe your right hand side, on my left hand side, it says, while this list is in no way exhaustive, the hope is that it can serve as a guide and give us some direction on where and how to start. The work of the faith. Please hear me when I say that the work of our faith as Christians, as believers, as followers of Jesus, as followers of the Spirit can be tiring and even sometimes dangerous. Right? I brought up earlier Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the confessing churches, right? But it is rewarding and fulfilling every step of the way. So, as individuals, here's what we can do. Learn more about the history and the language. By virtue of being here at our last conversation and even by being here at this conversation, you are doing just that, right? And I know that you'll probably do your own personal research when you get home or as you're home and later in the week. But learning the language, knowing what to hear, right? Knowing what to hear even in the sermon on Sunday, knowing what to hear at a funeral, right? Because oftentimes those are moments whenever individuals, pastors, clergy, whoever's giving the eulogy, believe that is their time to evangelize, right? And so they'll say different things, but knowing the language, research local communities of faith that are connected to this tradition of Christian nationalism, right? So know those local congregations, discern and reflect. All these things are what we can do as individuals. Discern and reflect our own contributions to Christian nationalism, because in some way, shape, or form, we have contributed to this practice, right? As much as we might have tried to escape it, we have in some way contributed. So understand that, discern and reflect on that. Pray and repent of our contributions, moving from just simple piety and prayers and words and traditionalism to actually pursuing justice and peace. Doing what Micah 6:8 says to do, right? To do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God. And then from there, we can invite others on this journey, right? As we have the language, as we ourselves have repented and have turned away and are doing something else. Then the things that we can do as a congregation that you can do in your local congregation, host a webinar series and sessions. As I mentioned earlier, me and Reverend Dr. Regina H. Moore from Christian Social Action in South Carolina, we did, I know it was a webinar series during the Advent season as well as during the Lenten season, to kind of get people prepared for civic education and those things. But do this, just as Reverend Dr. Copeland has done with the North Carolina Council of Churches. Host webinar series in your local context. And we're also doing this, I know, with a couple of congregations in the Alamance County area around civic education. Host these. Host these, whether they be in person, whether they be virtually. I know that we love potlucks, in the South and in North Carolina. We love gathering around food. Have that. Be in community with congregations of another race or ethnicity from a learning posture. So when I say this, I'm saying that we don't go in knowing or believing that we have all the answers, but go in knowing that there is something we can learn and being open to doing that, right? Being open, whether that's over shared meal, whether that is over dialogue or conversation, in a neutral place, or even stepping into the space as we are allowed into that other culture and community. Engage in a book study on Christian nationalism. There are many books, many books on Christian nationalism that would be beneficial for us to discuss. I can think of Power Worshippers. I can think of the recent book by Jim Wallace. It is very foundational. And like I said, a host of others that can be helpful. And so if you ever need those, I know we're going to leave our contact information. And so between the two of us and many others on the line, I know that we'll be able to have a book. You'll have a plethora of books to choose from. preach a series on the tenets of Orthodox Christianity. So, for those who are clergy ordained who preach on the regular, and you may be wondering, okay, what can I use this Sunday or things like that? Create a series on Orthodox Christianity of what was the early church doing? What was foundational? I mean, I know that we in so many ways are living in an age of countering traditionalism, but there are really true nuggets and valuable nuggets within the Apostles' Creed, within the Nicene Creed, within the things that came from the Council of Nicaea. There are really pertinent things to the book of Acts and to the Gospels. And the reflection in the life of the early church fathers and mothers. Teach and preach on those things that it will be beneficial. Lastly, reflect and interrogate church practices that might be rooted in Christian nationalism rather than in the character of God. And I want to highlight that real quick. I know that we in no way are we expecting or asking, even in this moment, for individuals to take the American flag out of your church. However, think on these things, right? Think on these things. Ask the questions and even ponder, why do we have the American flag in our churches? Right? Why are we doing these things? Interrogate some of the practices. What you can do as an annual conference or as a synod or as a member of a larger denomination or a member of a particular conference and things. Draft strong language countering the practice of Christian nationalism. Those documents are held in they are filed, and they are within the notes and history of a particular denomination. Have that language. So should this practice find itself in the upcoming decades and centuries, that those individuals can reflect back on what was done during this period. Host a lament segment within your sessions. I think we often stay away from this. However, there's a significant part of the Psalms, the book of Jeremiah, book of Lamentations. I mean, the fact that we have a whole book on lamenting in the Christian Bible and in the Hebrew Bible on lament, have that. There is a certain type of freedom that can come from releasing tears, releasing anger, releasing frustration onto God and navigating that as a community. So I highly recommend that on a spiritual level. Develop resources for local congregations on the concern. So be a part of or in community with the North Carolina Council of Churches, with General Board of Church and Society, with I know the Episcopal Church has their DC office. The Presbyterians have their office. The Baptists have their offices, all in DC. And even there are local churches who are doing this work. So partner with them to develop those resources. Partner with others within your connection. So if that is, again, your synod or your annual conference, partner with those throughout the connection who are doing this work, so that it is a fortified movement rather than just doing this in isolation. And then as an annual conference, you can host webinars, workshops, and seminars on the topic. Make sure though that they are solution and resistance oriented. You do the talking and the lament within community. But if you are hosting these webinars and workshops and seminars, try your best to ensure that they are solution and resistance oriented, and not just a time for people to get off their chest what they want to get off their chest. And then what we can do as a state and as a community, draft letters to the state legislature and Congress framing Christian nationalism as a national security threat, because it is. Because it is. This is not simply about individuals wanting to do the right thing or wanting to practice their faith in a particular way. This is a national security threat. It has been identified as such. It has been talked about as such. Bring this to the forefront of our leaders as that if we do not get this under handle, and if we do not take care of this, we run the risk of being a part, supporting either directly or indirectly, um, passively or actively, something that will bring harm to us and bring harm to our community members. Inform and educate your representatives, state and federal, on the dangers of this. So have the conversations with them. I saw, again, a number of United Methodist congregations as one who is working at GBCS. There's a time that you want to have a legislative session or a lobby day with your congresspersons. Please reach out to me and we can coordinate that so that you can voice the concerns of your district, of your church, and of your community to individuals who work for you, who are placed in office, and who your tax dollars are supplying gainful employment. Next, build community with your neighbors to better understand them, their faith, their culture. Amid all of what we're going through, because one of the things that we work on, which in my portfolio as a director of civil and human rights, is immigration. And if you turn to the list of platforms that Reverend Dr. Copeland mentioned, turning to those platforms and hearing what they have to say, you will think that individuals who are migrants or who have immigrated here and refugees are just terrible people. When the reality of this is these individuals are the ones who are working in our schools, right? Be it as a janitor, be it as a teacher. These are the individuals who are working in that favorite restaurant that you love to go to multiple times throughout the week, right? They are working there and they are doing a number of things that are contributing to the viability and the vitality of our community. But get to know them beyond just what they offer to the community and what they offer to you. Understand them, listen to them, be in conversation and community with them. Again, start a book club to develop resources, which we have a host of books to share with you and ways to develop those resources. And then lastly, host a lobby day to collaborate with other faith traditions and to build a local movement. This can be in Raleigh, this can be at your town council, this can be at your city council. This is connecting with um the Hindus that are in your community, the Muslims that are in your community, those that identify as Buddhists in your community. Having those conversations and building that coalition will prove fruitful and prove beneficial. And we have even the language and lived experience of Jesus by his encounter with the Syrophoenician woman who goes back to her community and is a evangelist in so many ways. But in doing so, realizing that this cross-cultural, cross-communal, cross-religious tradition work and conversations must take place.
Thank you, Kendal. I've been trying to answer some of the questions in the window as they come up, but there is one that I haven't answered yet. This question is defining the national security threat that might not be self-evident. I think there is a national security threat, but I also think there's a threat to our Christian faith because the beliefs of our Christian faith are being twisted into something that they were not originally meant to be. But on the national security threat, I think the real danger is the language that's used by the Christian nationalist movement. It's warring language, it's dominionist language, it's authoritarian language, it's power-grabbing language, and it's not language that I find buried in our scriptures. I find in our scriptures that God is with us, that Jesus is with us. This is not an overburdening with us, but it's a hand up with us. And so we're not talking about overthrowing people who differ from us. We're talking about loving them to death. We're talking about reaching out to people, or not we, but our scripture and our tradition, and then hopefully we as followers. Those are the mandates that we get from Scripture. We don't get the mandate to storm the Capitol building and to threaten people and to break things. And, you know, as it turns out, people died that day. You know, people died that day because a Christian nationalist agenda was taken to the extreme, and people honestly believed that they were the new crusaders. So, you know, lots of folks who invaded the Capitol have repented. You know, Kendall's talking about repentance earlier. Some of them have repented because they understand that they got duped by someone who was only after his own power. So, you know, that's kind of a short off the cuff answer to the national security threat. But I do believe it's real, and I do think that some of these books we've listed out, they're on our website also from our last information session about Christian nationalism. We collected a lot of those resources that many people offered to us, and we posted them there. So we're a little bit over time. We appreciate your patience. We're glad you're with us tonight. And Kendall's raising his hand. He's got one more thing to say.
No, I just wanted to touch on that real quick, and because with the national security threat, and I did reply to the message, but I want to kind of just touch on it real quick, not stay on it too long, but that what is taking place is whenever you use religious language to codify, anoint, ordain violence as a nation, as a nation. And we've seen this, you know, we've seen this in other things, right? We saw this in Germany. We've seen this, as mentioned earlier, with the Christopher Columbus and the Pope's words to the Portuguese. When you use that language to support violence towards individuals and towards people and towards countries, that historically comes back on you. And we have many examples of that. But that's where I'm talking about that national security threat. Because you are essentially saying that the God that we are serving, or the God that we abide by, has given us this authority. Whereas somebody else can say, well, the God that we serve is telling us to do the same thing, right? So we end up in this conundrum and kind of this cycle of violence, where we are stating that God is ordaining all of this, which could not be further from the truth. And so again, that Christian nationalist language is very harmful for our security, for the security that we say we are seeking. It is very, very harmful. So that's just a little bit on that. Definitely open to having further conversations about it, but just wanted to touch on that.
Thank you. Well said. All right, friends. I think we have exhausted our hour and then some. Again, we are grateful for your presence here. We know that you're here because you care about these things, and because you care about them, we care about you. So keep your eyes open for other information sessions that we have. Feel free to reach out to the council, reach out to Kendall in DC. I was telling somebody in the chat screen earlier, his office is right across the street from the Capitol building. So if you need somewhere to run in for a cup of water, you reach out to Kendall while you're over there talking to all your legislators. As Rachel has said, we'll be sending a recording to all the participants and all the people who registered for this later in the week. Feel free to share it. The slides that Kendall and I have presented to you tonight will be a part of the whole online presentation. There's not really a separate slide deck out there for us to make available to you. But you can go through here and find what you need. Most of the charts that I used to talk about tax and budgets, talk about public education, are available through Public Schools First NC and the North Carolina Tax and Budget Center. In fact, they have so much more information that you'll be overwhelmed by everything that's really going on. We tried to distill it tonight. All right, with that, I'm going to sign off. Peace be with you. Amen.